Welcome to the Relational Recovery podcast. I'm your host, Wes Thompson, joined by my co-host, Austin Hill. Today we're talking about relationships and the importance of cultivating healthy relationships and how trust plays a role and how our story also plays a role. So we hope this conversation is helpful, and thanks for listening. Good morning.
Good morning, Wes. How are you?
Doing okay. Doing well. Thank you. I'm reading The Relational Soul by Jim Cofield and Rich Plass again. And I just read chapter 2. And it just got me thinking about the importance. Obviously this book, right? The importance of relationships. And just the reality that how we relate to others is based and shaped by trust. And, Jim and Rich often say that the quality of our life is dependent upon the quality of our relationships. In other words, when our relationships are good, life tends to be pretty good. When our relationships aren't good, life tends to be really tough. And our capacity for relationship is formed very early. Being that we're made in God's image, like we're made for life-giving relationships with other people. I believe this was supposed to be first modeled and embodied in our family growing up, our family of origin. But when our families don't show up well because of their own wounds and sin and so on, we get wounded, we get traumatized, and we often mimic the behaviors of our caregivers. And so, in other words, what ends up happening is that our family wounds show up later in life, and these wounds must be reckoned with if we're going to grow, change, and heal. So I just want to talk a little bit around all that stuff, just how, especially with what we do at the refuge, when we're dealing with men, in particular, 18 years, male adults that are coming to us because of, typically, almost always because of some sort of substance use problem. I believe that that's unbeknownst to many of us, that our unwanted behaviors like addiction are shaped by those primitive wounds from when we were younger, just struggling to relate, trying to figure out a way to make sense of our life and the world and what we've been through. And without first, again, being, having a reckoning with our story, we tend to mimic what was modeled to us.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate because, think about it, right? Even the things about my parents that I'm not crazy about, I find myself doing at times.
Reacting to in an exaggerated way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if we think about it, we'll be like, oh, that's what dad did, or that's what mom did. And so even the things that we don't like, we often model from that early upbringing. And, if you were raised by your grandparents, or maybe you had a teacher or a coach or something really early on that shaped you, like those relationships might show up too, those early influential relationships, and we tend to mimic those for better or for worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But how we navigate through this life is really dependent upon growing in our capacity to have healthy relationships, which is, as you said earlier, before we pushed record, is dependent upon our capacity to trust.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And our capacity to trust is pre-downloaded on us by our parents. Because like you can't sit. I think what's really interesting and freeing, because this can kind of be a almost doom and gloom conversation, because you think about your childhood, and a lot, especially guys here at the refuge, if we think it's like, man, my childhood was really rough. I bounced around a lot, or like I didn't know my parents, I didn't know my dad, or I was abused, and it's just kind of like, well, I was just screwed from the beginning. But the reality is what we're saying. And the beautiful thing about how Jesus designed us to be in relationship, he didn't design us to be just in bad relationship. He designed us to be able to heal and grow in relationships. And what understanding how we relate to each other, how and why we relate the way we do is the starting point. And that can be difficult. So it's kind of like those steps of self-awareness and then self-acceptance, and then that leads to healing. So it's the first step to healing is being aware of how I relate to other people. And so looking at how you're the people that raised you, whoever that group or community was, whether it was a parent, whether it was grandparents, or just whoever the caregiver was, you're going to trust people based on your relationship with them. So that doesn't mean like if your parents were distrustful, it doesn't mean you're distrustful. It means how you related to those people that cared for you is how you relate. Because another Jim and Richism is how you relate is how you relate. And that starts early, like first 18 months of your life. It's kind of the foundation to how you trust for the rest of your life. And that's what you're working with. And that's how you learn and respond. So, again, this is a starting point. Understanding how we relate to each other and how we trust or don't trust ourselves and others is the starting point to how we're moving forward. So this isn't hey, if you got a rough childhood, you're, I guess it's just going to suck for you. That's not what we're saying. We need to understand how we relate. So we need to know our story to know why we relate the way we do, so that we can then take action and be aware and choose the path that's healthiest for us.
No, that's good. I think I'm just struck by, this is hard work.
Oh, yeah, it is. It is.
But it's also incredibly rewarding. I think it's easy to get overwhelmed at the outset, especially because many of us, we don't want to, it's hard to go back. It's hard to face what we've gone through, especially if it's been really tough. A lot of people, I was talking to a guy last week, and he was telling me a couple things. He was very emotional about it, and I asked him, and I'm like, who else have you told this to? And I was shocked, but he said no one. And I don't think that's uncommon. I think the tough things that we go through, especially for men, but probably for women too, we just kind of put our head down and just move forward, and just like I'm just gonna work my way out of this. I'm just gonna pretend like it didn't happen. I'm just thinking of different thoughts that I've heard or that I've even experienced. I'm just gonna, if I just don't think about it, then it'll be as if it didn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not owning it. That's not taking responsibility for what's ours. And then what you don't own owns you. What you're not in control of controls you. And within ourselves. And it's really devastating to come to the realization that the people put into your life, typically parents or loved ones that are supposed to care for you and put your needs, want what is best for you. It's devastating to realize that they didn't do their best, that they intentionally were selfish, that it's disappointing. And it's like, it brings up a whole bunch of other questions. Like, was I not worth it? Was I not Was I not good enough? What did I do to deserve this? Nothing. Like, the reality is, like, hey, here's a truth. You're messed up, but so are the people that raised you. They're also messed up in their own way. You can't do anything about how messed up they are. And you can't do anything about how you're messed up now from the past. But what you can do is acknowledge those things, be honest about them, and learn from those things. Because notice what we did, like, typically when we come to this realization, we start asking these questions of ourselves, like, am I not worth it? Why did they do that? What did I do to deserve this? I can't believe they did that. Like, those are all questions. It's deciding in that moment to acknowledge it, just take a deep breath, and then be curious about why. Like, why am I thinking this way? What is a productive question or an action-oriented, healthy question? It's like, what can I learn from this so I can have the life I want? Right? So it's different sets of questions. What do I want to do so I'm the type of parent that I think that I wanted? What's the best, healthier parent that I can be? What's a good brother that I can be? A good employee? A good manager? What do I think that looks like? And then what can I do to start living into that? Those are different questions that come from the same place of realizing that, man, I wasn't treated well. That sucks. Well, do I want to do that again? So because I was treated well, I'm going to choose to treat people poorly. Well, that doesn't do anything good. So it's like, hey, I was treated poorly. I see how it negatively impacted me. There's people in my life that I care about. I don't want to treat them poorly. So what can I do that doesn't look like that? Or what can I do? What do I think looks like a healthy relationship that treats people well with respect and kindness and accountability? So there's a ton, like when we first started this conversation, when you mentioned it before we pushed play, like, hey, we're going to talk about how we build trust and relate to each other. Like, there's all these different places we can go with this. This affects everything in your life. If you're wondering how you relate and how you trust, it affects everything in your life. Everything in your life. That's not even just being flippant. It's just being true, being honest. It affects everything.
Yeah. And I'm guessing there's individuals listening to us right now, and they're suspicious because essentially inside their head and their heart, they're saying, I don't trust you. I don't trust anybody. And I hear that, and that's real. But at the same time, I want to encourage you, if that's you, that just to try to imagine the fact that there are people in life that don't show up the way they're supposed to. And unfortunately for you, maybe it was those people early on in your life that were supposed to. But the reality is not everybody is like that. Not everybody is wounded to the point where they can't be consistent and reliable. There are trustworthy people in the world, and there are untrustworthy people in the world. It's learning to build the capacity to try to trust again, because unfortunately what happens if we don't trust anybody is we also never get close to anybody. And that is devastating to the human soul, to the human psyche. And it would make sense why someone is running to drugs to make them feel a certain way. Often euphoric if you have no close relationships and or you don't trust anyone. That's not going to end well.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And then there's the other side of that. Is some people respond in a way where, like, hey, I don't trust anybody. I only trust me. And then there's some people, I'm in the opposite camp where I trust everybody first. I don't trust me. Tell me what to do. Tell me how to make this right. What do you need? I'll do it. I'll be what you need me to be. I'll say what you need. That's it. A lot of people who are really good at helping and like serving, like that's what they're going after, is like, tell me what to do. Cause I don't trust myself. I haven't put the work in to know what it is that I want, those type of things. So if you're looking around like, man, I trust other people. I just don't trust myself. And it's the same work that you're talking about, Wes, in building trust in others happens. It's the same type of work that you have to do for yourself. It's like, you need to trust yourself, learn to trust yourself, and realize that you're not just garbage. Like, yes, you've made mistakes, but so have other people. They've made mistakes. And the grace and forgiveness that you show others, you deserve also towards yourself. And it's practicing that grace that's reciprocal, the same patience that you show for someone else, the same desire to care for someone else. Other people, believe it or not, point that towards you. And that's that going in from self-awareness to self-acceptance is accepting the fact that, like, hey, I have a hard time trusting myself. So it's going to be difficult for me to move forward in certain things if I don't realize it. And it's going to be difficult for me when I do realize it to then start taking those first steps of trusting myself and being like, hey, I can be confident in who I am because I am deeply loved. I'm deeply loved by the people around me. They know who I am and they still love me. They know my flaws. They know how I've messed up. And they still love me. So it's those steps going forward of, yes, it is like, it's not just I don't trust anybody, so I have a hard time relating. Then there's the people who like, hey, I don't trust myself, so I have a hard time relating. And they both of those extremes of I don't trust anybody and I don't trust myself, the extremes of those lead to isolation and loneliness. And guess what? When you're isolated and lonely, you don't make really good choices consistently. And then that leads to consequences that lead you into deeper loneliness and isolation. And the solution to both of those is realizing that to heal from that is to be in relationship with other people. And being able to sit with the mess and pain of being in a relationship. But being in a relationship is a much better pain than being alone. It's worth it. It's worth the pain. It's worth the effort of learning to trust yourself and learning to trust others appropriately. So like the inappropriate way of, like, from when you first started talking about it, Wes, I don't trust other people. It's inappropriate to only trust yourself in everything. Like, cause we don't know everything about everything. And it's also not appropriate to never trust ourselves because you know sometimes. You always have room to learn, but you do know stuff. So it's the appropriate amount of trust.
Yeah, it's like we've talked about before. I mean, if you imagine you're driving down a road and there's a ditch on either side, in this analogy, right? The one ditch to your left is only trusting in yourself, and the ditch on the right is not trusting yourself at all. So we're only trusting others. One is a more, what we might call avoidant style. The other is a ambivalent, or I've heard it as a anxious style. But essentially, like you said, the goal is to be trustworthy and then try to cultivate appropriate trust of other people, which really, I think, really only grows when we surround ourselves with trustworthy folks. Because if you're with untrustworthy people, you're not going to be able to build trust because, well, they're not trustworthy.
Yeah.
So in other words, if you got a friend, or unfortunately maybe a family member who isn't reliable, or in other words, they're consistently not showing up when they say they're going to show up for you, not doing what they say they're going to do. I mean, it can be simple stuff, but if that's their MO, if that's their consistent behavior, it's going to be really hard to trust them. You probably shouldn't, maybe even. You could argue maybe you shouldn't trust them, right? Because I'm not your temperament, Austin. I'm more avoidant, which means I don't trust people quickly. That's not always good, obviously. But like if people are consistently untrustworthy, I think it makes sense for me not to trust them.
Yeah.
And so but if I left that situation saying I'm not going to trust anybody because of what they did, well, that's not going to serve me well either. I think the goal is to find trustworthy people, right? Reliable people. They do what they say they're going to do. And we all make mistakes, but more often than not, they're doing what they aim to do. They're showing up in a reliable way. And if you start to surround yourself with trustworthy people, I think you make the effort to try. I think over time, you throw in the category then of time. Over time, I think that's how we can grow our capacity to trust more.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's the example that why I think we're talking about appropriate trust is we trust different people in different ways all the time, every day. Like we trust the people who, if we're driving, we trust that the drivers on the other side of the road coming the opposite way are going to stay in their lane. We trust them to do that. That's an act of trust. That's a small one, but we do that every day, all the time. A different one is like, I trust my 12-year-old daughter. I would not trust her to do brain surgery on me, but I would trust a brain surgeon who I've never met to do brain surgery on me in an emergency. Those are different levels of trust. It's appropriate trust. I think there's layers to it and depth to trust. Like I think a good sign of being able to like have appropriate trust is knowing how much of my story to share with somebody. So like using the example that you had, Wes, where you talked to that gentleman last week, he showed an unbelievable amount of trust in you to share something with you that he's never shared with someone else. And I think we can all think of times in our own lives when someone has shared something deeply personal with us. That is a deep level of trust. Different than when someone asks, what'd you do this weekend? And then you give them the highlights. That's a level of trust. So what we're saying is if you've identified people in your life that aren't trustworthy for like the deep, vulnerable, personal things, that doesn't mean we like cut them out of our lives. It just means like, hey, I can't share. This person has proven not to be trustworthy when it comes to certain vulnerabilities in my life. I'm not going to tell them everything, but I am going to share parts of who I am. And the mistake we make that we're talking about is we could know 10 people in our lives, and if one person hurts us deeply, then we don't share anything about ourselves with the other 9. When 5 of them could be really trustworthy people that want to be in relationship with you, but we withhold ourselves from them, and we miss out on the opportunity to be in deep relationship with others. So that's what it's in a safe, appropriate way to gauge how much we can trust is to share your story consistently over time with a group of people that are trustworthy. And a good example of that is when we're sharing our story with guys who have similar experiences to ours. So that's what the Refuge does, is we have a bunch of guys who have very similar stories. They're all a little different, but they rhyme. Sharing that story, realizing I am not alone. I'm not the only one who's hurt, lied, cheated, ruined a lot of my family relationships. Like, hey, I'm not the only. This other guy had the same story as me, almost identical. Man, he'll understand the pain that I experience because I understand his pain. And I think what we need to just be aware of is that in any relationship, the level of the more vulnerable that you can be with somebody, the deeper that relationship will get. But the level of vulnerability that relationship can go to depends on who can be the least vulnerable, right? So if you're more vulnerable in a relationship, you're the one who's kind of pulling the other person out. Like, you know, it kind of like, hey, I'm just pulling stuff out of you. Like, it's because I'm willing, and I'm more in that moment more trusting of our relationship than this other person. So I'm going to share more to prove that, hey, I'm willing. Because the act of being, when we say vulnerable, a good analogy is it's I'm giving you the tools to hurt me deeply and trusting you don't use them. That's what it is. It's like, here's all these things that could really hurt me if you use them in a certain way. But I am telling you to them, and I'm trusting that you won't laugh at me and hurt me. But there's always that opportunity. Because the truth is, the people that we are in the deepest relationships with hurt us the most because they know our vulnerabilities. Because, like, how could they do that? I told them all these things. They know these things about me. They know that would hurt, but yet they still did it. But that is the risk of relationship. And it's being able to have that muscle it's like working out. How resilient can we be in building a deep trust with other people and being okay with the hurt that comes with being in a relationship? Because it is definitely worth it. Like, I'll use my wife as an example. It is the closest relationship I have, but she hurts me the most. And guess what? I hurt her the most. But we heal the most with each other. So it's kind of like this. Like, in order to grow, we have to be able to be vulnerable. In order to be vulnerable, we have to be okay with being hurt. And then when that does happen, it's knowing, it's like, did this person do that on purpose because they want to hurt me? Or is it just, it's a part of the risk of being in a relationship? And that's where the healing comes. It's knowing that, like, hey, this person hurt me, but it wasn't to harm. It wasn't, I want to hurt you. I want to harm you in such a way that it's negative. So this is hard, messy work. And it's not something we should just jump in. Guys shouldn't just go to work today and just share their deepest, darkest secrets with everybody on the job site. Practice it with someone that you trust, someone that you know will hold you accountable. That's a good way to say, can I trust this person? Have they held you accountable for something? You could probably trust them. Have they held you accountable in a way that is kind and loving? You could probably trust them.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Relational Recovery Podcast. We'll be back soon with a new conversation. We'll see you then.